whether you believe in God or not, some questions are so big that they compel us all to think existentially. We live in a world where some say there's too much water and not enough bridges. My name is Munib, and this is the GODCAST. A new space, a new type of conversation, the biggest questions of our existence. A place where we want to spark a global exchange with you, the audience, about some questions which are overdue since antiquity. Joining me today is Sabahat Ali, a graduate student of language and theology, which he has been studying for over 10 years now. It's great to have you join me, Sabahat. How are you?
I'm well, thank you very much. How are you, Munib?
Good. So, this being the first episode of the GODCAST, I think one of the things that we need to discuss, and this is right off the get-go, is this idea that, and I think a lot of the viewers that are watching this, they might have this concern. Well, this God that you speak of, we can't see him, we can't hear him, nor is there any apparatus to measure him. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge subset of people, and, I can sympathize with certain elements of their claim, and they would be saying that if you can't measure it, what's the utility in it? Or if you can't measure it, is it even real? So these are the first questions that I think maybe you want to talk about for a bit.
That's very true. If God exists, why can't we see him? And it's interesting because not all atheists subscribe to this as a litmus test. I have come across many atheists, both online and in, real life, at least before the whole pandemic, kept us away from one another. The reason that understanding the limits of perception is so important in this discussion is that most of the world accepts as fact things that they haven't actually empirically confirmed for themselves. That's really important to remember. I think it is very safe to say that a vast majority of humankind, the average person will live his or her entire life convinced of the existence of billions of things that they've never personally confirmed through observation. From, the myelin sheaths that run, through our nervous system to the moon landing. It's something that we take really, in terms of our personal perspective, it's anecdotal, really. We just heard somebody say it. Yes, it may have evidence to back it up, but how many of us actually have seen and believe that, right? We have different apparatus, like you said, to perceive different things according to their attributes and composition. If you ask me that, I'm not going to believe in gamma rays unless I can smell them, right? Or if even more strange, if you ask me that you have to taste the speed of sound, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. So, yet some atheists are stuck on this. That God, the inconceivably powerful, intangible force, which created space and time, whether you call it God or you call it the singularity or whatever it was, that brought the universe from a state of obsoleteness to bustling with astronomical wonders within moments, should somehow become confined to a physicality so that we see him. When we know that we only see like 1/10 trillionth, I think it is, of even the light spectrum. Right. So I would close this point with what Einstein said. Don't take my word for it. Take the word of a man who spent his entire life grappling with the grandest mysteries, using the bleeding edge of science. He said, it is entirely possible that behind the perception of our senses, worlds are hidden of which we are totally unaware.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, Einstein's an interesting example because, we'll get into this at the latter part of this discussion, but Einstein wasn't really satisfied with the quantum theory. He thought of it in terms of fields, but he said there has to be something underlying it. In the famous quote, it's always debated on its connotations, but he said, God doesn't play dice. And it was an interesting one because it was around that time where people felt that, the most famous physicist in the world is contradicting a view of relatively pure brute fact empiricism. And after that, the quote, and if you look at the full quote, it makes sense, started getting, not shown properly, not replicated in text reliably, but also to address one of the other things that you talked about, David Hume, a philosopher, and this is the age-old ought is question, is on one hand, we have this idea of blind faith like you talked about. Most people don't themselves empirically confirm a lot of the things they believe in. They're just told by others, and they rely on someone's honesty or how they view someone to interpret that. But in the ought is debate, and this I think brings up something really important, you can't really derive an ought from an is, and an is being a fact. And I think one of the problems with that is because, well, like you said, we have sensory limitations. So we only have a limited amount of is. There's only a limited amount of facts to choose from. And then another thing is, out of all the facts to choose from, which ones do you pick?
Yeah.
Do you pick the ones that confirm your opinion, or do you pick the ones that contradict them? And I think that's something that gets brung up. It gets brung in conversations when we're talking about that undertones of dogmatism that sometimes comes with empiricism. And again, not claiming that everyone subscribes to that.
I agree. I think when we go back, I would go back to that question: if God exists, why can't we see him? I think there is, beyond those few words, whatever, like 10 words or whatever that make up that question, there are oceans of inconsistencies with our honest investigation, as well as what science tells us. I mean, this demand not only insults all facets of logic, but it runs unapologetically contrary to everything that we know scientific observation and experience itself. And I always say that it's a paradox perhaps worthy only of God himself. Because, look, there are so many things that are not physically seen, but exercise huge control over the workings of the human kingdom. Take love, for example. How do you empirically measure love? How do you repeat the idea of love? You know love by its effect. You know it by the effect that it has on the person who is in love, and the one with whom that person is in love, the lover, knows it by the effect that is protruded or emanates from that person, the loyalty, the fidelity, camaraderie, and all of those different facets of love. So we know that love is an invisible force. By definition, it's definitionally invisible. It's known by its effect, but it's capable of driving the greatest of minds to madness and turning melancholy to merriment. And so, but I would like to just add, atheists very fairly argue that love is still known by everyone. Everyone feels love. Everyone testifies to its existence. You know what I mean? But that's precisely the point, that many forces and concepts and truths exist that are known through means other than the physical senses. And so to demand that God should be seen by our physical eyes doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, I think it's a case where I feel like the underlying framework of the question itself already relies on an innate bias, which in this case would be, is it matter? And, that's like kind of the age-old debate, it's mind versus matter. And I think you see aspects of this materialism and this reductionism down to that same idea in all elements. Because what you talked about, like love, for example, or, if we want to address the elephant in the room, morality and consciousness, because that's largely been ignored. And when you hear explanations for why is it that something like consciousness even exists, you hear, well, evolution over multiple iterations, the synapses in our mind and the chemical gradients lined up in a way to take us from the hunter-gatherers that we were for the most part of our evolution to people who were thinking about cosmic rays and patterns in other galaxies and extraterrestrial life. And I think what people don't understand is this sliver of the last 50 years of human existence. It doesn't account for most of our evolution.
Exactly. Evolution doesn't account for that last 50-year jump, certainly. I agree.
Yeah, I agree. And we also have this, I think, misconception, because it appears that people didn't think that, for example, civilizations millennia ago were also asking these questions, and through lineage by lineage, generation by generation, these ideas persist. And, you know, like, you got to ask yourself from a Darwinian perspective, maybe, why is it?
That's very interesting. I'd like to also add, you know, you talked about the idea of materialism. And with materialism, I think the idea of scientism is something that we have to touch on, because I guess scientism, by and large, believes that maybe science is the only source of obtaining knowledge about the world, really.
Yeah.
But the problem is that, you know, those people who subscribe to scientism, they stand upon the same precipice of blind faith that they call so shaky and unreliable. For example, science is based upon certain presuppositions that are totally inescapable, right? Mm-hmm. In the Conduct of Inquiry, Abraham Kaplan, he writes something really interesting. He says, if we deny or challenge the sensory experience, I'm paraphrasing, then how can we confirm the reality of anything perceived? The belief in scientism is based on the grandest unproved assumption of all, really, that the universe is structured in a way that only science can provide us with knowledge of it. Do you see what I mean? That's one presupposition. And then there are certain assumptions that are philosophically and rationally inescapable. Like, let's say a presupposition of faith is that the universe has a cause, but that's also a presupposition of logic. The idea of spontaneous generation, biology, it's something that science has ridiculed religion about. But do scientists make no use of faith? That's absolutely untrue. Scientists have to accept certain presuppositions, certain propositions on faith before they can even commence scientific inquiry, right? And the reason that many, that many don't like this conversation is that there's no way to confirm that what our physical senses are perceiving is reality. There's no way to externally demonstrate that. And so we have to take what we've given. And so eventually a scientist is forced to say, well, that's just how it is. And that sounds very familiar to some of those answers that perhaps people received in church. Not to justify that that's an answer. You know, that's not an answer. But there are limitations on both sides that need to be acknowledged.
Yeah. And I think it's important you bring that up because, you know, we were talking about this earlier, and we know, for example, we go back to the 1600s, and there was this man named Descartes who kind of had this idea of a dualism, and we talked about this, the mind, the matter, and he had this idea, you know, Cartesian dualism, of the fact that one half of existence itself can be defined through spiritual, you know, whether it's God, angels, or mystical experiences, and the other half, and we're all well aware of this, is the Cartesian plane. It's space and time. And I think as time continued, we just got rid of the other half.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, I think a good example to kind of encapsulate a good picture of this. So John Eccles, and I have this quote from him here. So he won a Nobel Prize for in neurophysiology. And he kind of told the world what a synapse is. And that's really important because, you know, we saved countless lives in the fields of cardiology, neurology, and nephrology. But he says, I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, with its claim to promissory materialism, to account eventually for all of the spiritual world in terms of patterns of neuronal activity. This belief must be classified as a superstition. We have to recognize we are spiritual beings with souls existing in a spiritual world, as well as material beings with bodies that exist in a material world. And it's
Very
interesting because people will tell you, listen to the greatest scientists. It's like, which ones? Right? Dr. Abdul Salam comes and he's talking about like this idea of a God particle.
Yeah, the grand unification, yeah.
Right. So, and I think what's really interesting, what really captivated me about this quote was it must be classified as a superstition. And that's slightly oxymoronic because you usually use that claim for a religion, right?
Yeah. I agree. I mean, you're talking about scientists. I guess, we have to throw Nikola Tesla in there, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, he's the face of science for so many today. He writes that the day science begins to study non-physical phenomena, you were talking about oxymorons and juxtapository statements. This is Nikola Tesla talking, right? The day science begins to study non-physical phenomena, it will make more progress in 1 decade than in all the previous centuries of its existence. I mean, that is a very far-fetched thing for a man immersed in the technological sciences to say, right? And I think, we were talking about this before, the Galileo effect. That's really what it is. There are, if you talk to general science students, especially many of them, a lot of them, the atheistic science students, a lot of them will go through, who I've met, university especially, they're going through this new atheism, fanaticism kind of phase.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Where they're, fanboying or fangirling over Richard Dawkins and all of these people, right?
Yeah.
But when you look at the most, those scientists who are given to the most profound level of thinking, those scientists that scale the loftiest horizons of scholastic excellence, they are pointing out that Galileo was banned by the church 400 years ago. And now those scientists who dare to challenge the dogmatism of contemporary scientific factions are also being banned.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I want to give the other side a fair chance here. And I'll be honest, so in my interactions, roughly, and especially when it comes to theology, we'll have these conversations on, the dogmatism surrounding empiricism. But it's interesting because you can sway one or either way quite drastically.
Dogmatism, I agree. I have to disclaim this before I get eaten alive. Thank you. Dogmatism in all of its forms, extremism and asymmetrical inquiry and observation in all of its forms. I always say that those people who are dogmatic about the G-force and those people who are dogmatic about Jesus are equally guilty insofar as they're throwing away or casting away of their intellectual duty, really moral duty, to look at things fairly.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm glad you brought that up. And another thing is that even that fight against dogmatism, we actually risk being asymmetrical because nowadays, and I'm going to be completely honest, I interact as many people claiming that there is no reality and therefore morals are all relative and nothing's empirical. And, as a medical student, I'm kind of sitting here saying that, well, if you're developing a drug for cancer, it might help you to be a little empirical.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that what is needed is a philosophy that truly concatenates these two, that allows them to coexist in the same space. And I feel like we're losing that dynamic where certain people think that everything's a construct, nothing's real, and therefore we are at the mercy of our own thoughts.
Yeah.
And then there's the other side of it that, like we just talked about with the dogmatism and whether it's empiricism, radicalism, it could be anything.
That's really interesting. Every animal across the strata of biological variation has its own window on reality, right? because their bio-optical receptors vary. You know better than I. Their Umwelts in German, we say, right? Their reality of what it is that they see around them, the around you is the Umwelt. It varies. And I was watching a talk a little while back, and this neuropsychologist, he brings up something really, really interesting. Neurophysiologist, sorry.
Okay, yeah.
He starts off his talk, and after a few really interesting points, he's like, remember the Truman Show? That movie that we all probably watched in grade school, and it's a classic, right?
Yeah.
For those who don't know, I just want to say basically it's about a guy. You have to watch it if you want to understand this idea of reality and whatnot. And basically it's Jim Carrey, I think, at his peak. And he is the star of a TV show since he was born. The whole TV show circumambulates around his existence. Everyone's an actor, even his best friend, his parents, everything. And that movie asks so many questions that, like, there could be an entire video podcast just on that, right? But basically there comes a point where basically I think near the first third of the movie, where one of the journalists are asking, like, the creator of the show, who effectively is like the god of the show, of that Truman Show, why do you think it is that he, the main character, has never come close to discovering the true nature of his world? And there's a one-liner that I think it has to be one of Hollywood's hardest hitters. It says, because we all accept the reality of the world as it's presented to us, right? It's so profound. So it's really, I mean, this idea of who was it? I think, I forget, we were talking about the scientist who actually found the inconsistencies across 20 years of astrophysics literature in one of the constants. I forget his name. Anyway, he goes to the dean of this faculty.
Yeah.
It's the banned TED Talk. It's definitely worth YouTubing if you haven't seen
Rupert
it.
Sheldrake.
Yeah, it's Sheldrake, exactly. Yeah. So Sheldrake taking, he there's a true story, by the way, for those who don't know, and please definitely check out this TED Talk. And the fact that it's banned, maybe you can touch on that afterwards, shows that dogmatism, it exists, it definitely in the West. And then did you notice that his book has a different title in the United States?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's like this science delusion somewhere else, and then something else in the US.
Something about science, right? So in this is a reflection of both dogmatisms. Religious dogmatism in the United States, perhaps, for which his book is not allowed to be called what it's called. And then scientific dogmatism is what he writes about in the book, where he went to the dean of whatever university he was at, I forget, and he showed him these inconsistencies in the constant of, was it the G-force constant, right?
Big G, gravitational constant.
Yeah, gravitational constant, thank you. And what does the dean say? He's like, oh God, I mean, paraphrasing, he's like, oh gosh, you've come across, the most embarrassing period of our scientific inquiry. And then he tries to press it. He's like, okay, but this is off by like a lot for 2 decades.
Like magnitudes above the margins of error.
Yeah. And they're like, oh, well, you know what? It's just, he tries to brush it off as a happy coincidence. But Sheldrake pushes, on. He's like, you're telling me that for 20 years, all the scientists in the world, across the world, consistently agreed that we're going to be off by this much? You know what I mean? It's not possible. So a lot of things are brushed under the rug. But I do want to very quickly say, and I'd like to know your thoughts, especially about things like this that are pushed under the rug in the scientific community. A catfish has like 175,000 sensitive cells with which it tastes. Okay, taste buds effectively, 175,000. A human being only has 10,000 taste buds, right? So we'll never know what we're missing. Right, and this is one example. If there's a bloodhound, for example, who hears, and its giant floppy ears and its nose designed to smell exorbitantly, gargantuanly more than us.
Yeah,
we'll never know. Like, we're basically blind in the nose compared to a dog like that. We're basically without a tongue compared to the catfish, but we don't know what we're missing. And that's exactly the point about, I guess, this idea of metaphysics. We don't know what we don't know. And we don't miss it. You know, if you think about how much money we're trying to exercise for new flavors and new ways, we're desperate to try new food. That's where food addiction comes from. That's the multi-trillion-dollar industry. But we don't miss the 90% of the flavor that we're missing because we've never experienced it.
It's never our reality.
Yeah, we don't even consider it a part of what we could be enjoying. Like there's a tiny demographic of women who have 4 photoreceptors instead of 3. So they're experiencing colors that we can't know. We can't possibly envisage. And we can come to the super tasters after.
Yeah, no, I agree with just about everything you said, except for the fact that Jim Carrey peaked at the Truman Show. But, okay, so I think that's really interesting. And, you can bring up many examples. The way dolphins communicate and, like that idea you brought up at the start is visible light, electromagnetic spectrum. They're not the same. And I think we have a hard time even grappling with just that simple idea. One of the things you brought up again with, like, for example, the sheldrake. By the way, for the sheldrake example, a lot of people listening to this, they're going to say, well, come on, give him a break. It's a constant. It's going to have some error, but I just hope that people realize that the errors are minuscule, tiny decimal places.
Yeah.
It's not at the order that was that he confronted the dean about, or whoever that was. The other thing I wanted to bring up, and I think this is unique as a medical student, because a lot of people, they might be listening to this and they're not convinced. Well, show us evidence. I actually don't agree that we're too empirically driven. In our schools, if you're going over an ethics case, the backwards example is always the religious folk, right? They don't get science, and they can't understand it. And that's notwithstanding the fact that some of the greatest advancements in medicine came during the Islamic Revolution in Baghdad. And you can feel free to look this up for yourself, for those interested. And another aspect, and we've talked about this, is, for example, mindfulness. They teach this as a course, as an adjunct to most schools, and it's interesting because to me it's always felt very similar to what different spiritual practices follow. This idea of, it's like taking prayer and you just strip any religious connotation. So I also thought that might be interesting to discuss.
I fully agree. So David Rosemarin, assistant professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School and director of the spirituality and mental health program at McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts, says something really interesting. He says scientists have no way to measure the existence of a higher power, of course. And they've done little research on any health benefits of prayer. Why? Because of a serious lack of funding in the medical community for spiritual research. And you touched on something really powerful before, Munib. There are people who, after years of therapy, relapse and commit suicide. It does not work. And then there are those people in the chaotic, toxic realm of addiction who come out of addiction through spiritual regimen. I mean, that's a very powerful thing, wherever that's coming from, in an unbiased way. The amount of force that it takes, the amount of mental, psychological, spiritual, whatever force you want to call it, neurological for our empiricists, for our materialists, I should say. It's interesting because when we have powerful drugs and psychology, the realms of psychology, the domains of inquiry surrounding psychology are at their absolute pinnacle, why is it that even then that fails, but spiritual regimen in addiction therapy is helping? Maybe you can shed some light on that. I remember you were talking about this.
Yeah, I think you summarized it pretty well. So these people who claim these experiences, they define it in an interesting way. A almost spontaneous spiritual awakening. right? And that's a powerful term, because a religious person might call that a miracle. And to someone else, well, it's just a happy coincidence. And I don't want to deviate from the question, but I want to, this again, it's another elephant in the room. And I know this is something we also did want to discuss this episode. There's a quote that goes something like this: "Give us one big miracle and we'll explain all the rest." So this is more of a question, and I want the audience to think about this as well, but I'll ask it to you. If we haven't been able to explain the miracle, like the miracle that talks, the miracle that's the beginning of existence itself, the universe, the patterns, the laws, all of it, right? If we can't even explain that, then what's the point in believing any other miracle?
Yeah. So when it comes to this idea of the Big Bang, there are a couple of things that we have to remember. One point that I really like, that I really do enjoy from our atheist brothers and sisters in humanity, is they say, number one, just because science can't explain everything about the Big Bang doesn't mean that your version, or religious version, is the only other option. Mm-hmm. Or the logical conclusion. I fully agree with that.
Yeah, I agree.
I fully agree. And I think that theists have done by and large, a terrible job of trying to say that the Big Bang itself is direct evidence for their religion, right? There is a train of thought that is required. And one thing that we have to acknowledge is, why does the universe exist at all? This is something that is in the realm of metaphysics. There are, 2 or 3 main branches of metaphysics, although there are several. One of them is obviously ontology. The why does anything exist, or the extent to which something exists. I personally cannot stand the argument from ontology for God. I completely stand with atheists, hand in hand, as a person who believes in God, that is a terrible argument. Terrible argument. And then the argument from cosmology, whether it's the argument from motion, whether it's the argument from causation, that does not demonstrate the truth of your religion. It can lead you to the point that there should be a cause. For example, the cosmological argument, one of the branches is the argument from causation. That if you keep going back and asking the question, what created that? What created that? I was watching a talk at the University of Oxford, and I was amazed at how blindly people, with such brazen confidence, take Richard Dawkins' very, very, very poor argument of infinite regress. Right? Where he says that, okay, eventually if you say that the last thing in the line of who created that and who created that and who created that, why do we stop at God? It is such a poor argument. God is definitionally in the 3 greatest Abrahamic faiths, for example, and therefore the most consequential God to investigate. People are always like, which God do we investigate? This one or this one or this one? The God that exists in the 3 Abrahamic faiths is, by definition, the one that claims to have started it all. And that's what makes things really interesting. If your argument, Richard Dawkins' argument, is the argument of infinite regress, you're just going to keep going, right? Why stop at God? You stop at God because you stop at an infinity. You replace the infinite regress with a being that is infinite. A thing that is infinite is definitionally without beginning and without end.
Because the reason I brought up that miracle, I don't want to be too harsh. That's what I wasn't insinuating, wasn't that there's a genuine, intuitive, potentially answer that people have to explain away certain miracles, for example. This is the type of conversation I was getting at, because it almost feels, for example, with the argument you brought up, that it's almost a semantic argument, right? Like, people will call it nature and maybe explain it away with that, and then there's
but it's
infinite
not. But it's not
regress.
nature. But that's what I mean.
Exactly.
Infinite regress doesn't make sense. Nature doesn't make sense
Right.
because nature is time, space, and matter.
Yeah.
And anybody who knows anything about the empirical evidence that we use to substantiate the Big Bang Theory knows that nature didn't exist before that. So if it's not a natural cause, then by definition, it's a supernatural cause.
Yeah, exactly. That, and then I think what you were referring to earlier, like just before this talking point, was the people who choose to say that, well, just because we don't have an answer doesn't mean that your answer is the correct one. But I almost feel that in the face of a challenging philosophical question, they default to no answer.
Mm-hmm.
And that almost to me is
without investigating fairly
exactly
other offerings.
And that's why you always hear these theologic philosophers, and maybe even I think we share the same opinion, is that it's not taken seriously enough. And this is a real issue that we're having today. And this idea of skepticism, like being skeptical. I mean, the idea from a secular humanist might be something like, well, I don't know if there's a God, and therefore I can't agree to it. And it's interesting, which, by the way, sounds rational, sounds relatively intuitive, but they seem to be skeptical of all other doctrine except theirs, which is generated around, well, how do you explain away consciousness, for example? And you'll have ideas of well-being, and you'll have other ideas, like, for example, surrounding free will. But the skepticism is very selective.
I agree with you. I'm reminded of actually I have the quote in front of me. Mia Bashir Ahmad, he has written a book called Our God. And I would invite, our viewers to definitely take a look at it. He has some really, really interesting points. He says that if someone says that he will not believe in God unless he sees him with his own eyes, all I should say is that if God could be seen with human eyes, he would not be worth believing in at all. He is his own creation. He's reduced to his own creation. He goes on to say, this is because in such a case, many of his other attributes would be falsified. His omniscience, his omnipotence, his omnipresence, his being incorporeal, for instance. He goes on to say he's incorporeal, for instance. But in this case, he would become corporeal. He is infinite, but then he would become finite. So that would completely decimate all of his grand attributes, certainly the attributes that are different between him as the creator and his creation. And so he wouldn't be God anymore anyway. He goes on to say that he's infinite, but would become finite, and so on and so forth. And then he closes with something interesting. You're talking about skepticism, right? He says, moreover, if God were to adopt a corporeal and finite form for your sake, what is there to guarantee that you would not reject him, saying that you don't believe in a God that's corporeal and finite? So this is, to what extent is skepticism a tool for the truth? That's something we have to always ask ourselves.
Exactly. And we've already, the last thing you finished off with was brilliant. We've already seen that. I don't want to misrepresent, but I believe it was Hitchens who was asked, if God came
Dawkins.
to you,
Dawkins, yeah.
Yeah, if you physically saw God, like he came to you with that proclamation, what do you think? And he's like, well, I'd probably be better off thinking I'm hallucinating.
Exactly. So I always say, not to cut you off, but I always say that we have to remember that there are people who are atheists first and scientists second. They are skeptics first and seekers of truth second. And on the other hand, I believe in God. There are way too many people, even today, who have already made up their mind that no matter where the evidence leads me, even if rationality and logic and the universe itself demonstrates that there is no God, I will still hold on dogmatically to my God, and there is no need for me to open up and defend this view. And this is something that Islam categorically outright rejects. It is a sin in Islam to blindly believe in something for which there is absolutely no evidence. Right? So it's something to remember. Islam, I have an interesting quote here as well for that Islam always, Richard Dawkins, he writes, faith unsupported by evidence is a lethal weapon. But Helen Keller's quote balances it out beautifully. She said that the only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision. And sweeping allegations have been leveled against Islam that it commands its followers to adopt such beliefs as have no empirical, rational, or otherwise reasonable bases. And Dawkins says that an atheist is somebody who believes that there is nothing beyond the natural physical world. But I'd like to explain that the Holy Quran uses a particular word for the unseen, which is ghaib. And the Mirza Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad, the second caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, has written a 10-volume commentary on the Holy Quran. And he says that the word ghaib used in the Quran never means, as assumed by some hostile critics, imaginary and unreal things, but real and verified things, though unseen. It is therefore wrong to suppose that Islam forces upon its followers some mysteries of faith and invites them to believe in them blindly. And he goes on to explain that the word ghaib means things which, though beyond the comprehension of human physical senses, can nevertheless be proven by reason or experience. The supersensible, he closes, the supersensible need not necessarily be irrational. Nothing of the unseen which a Muslim is called upon to believe is outside the scope of reason. And that is why the Islamic scientific golden age preceded the European Enlightenment by hundreds of years. And the Islamic scientific golden age was a result, Munib, we have to remember. It was a result of the endorsement of academic and secular education along with spiritualism that Islam endorses. Unlike the European Enlightenment, which was a result of shedding the skin of Christian faith.
Even to today, and for example, you mentioned the Dawkins quote about faith as a lethal weapon. I think it's also important to contextualize this idea that this new wave, and I like to call it evangelical atheism, because you have these people, absolutely. The four horsemen that
there are churches now. There are churches in South America, and
and they go around and they're these new pulpits who have these lethal, in my opinion, conversations that shut out other conversation. And it's also interesting that, potentially some of them been around from before, but they really became vocal following the Gulf War and especially 9/11. So you can see there's a lot of complex sociology, politics, and geopolitics involved in it. And you can obviously hear it in their opinions. Yeah. But, that's why I think that it's very important for whoever's, for example, listening to this, is just because that's the fundamental structure that we've experienced, the educational system, most of our institutions, our government has been largely secular and pushing away from religion. I think people should be more understanding of it in a way that, hey, I'm not telling you that someone who's religious is right, but at least give them the opportunity to present the case. And I think we're losing touch with that type of dialogue.
I agree. Both sides are at fault. Mm-hmm. For too long, religious people, a lot of religious people, especially in the Christian world, apologetics is relatively new, but in the Christian world, I saw that people were not making much noise. And if they really felt that balancing science was a thing, which wasn't really expressed when Galileo was put under house arrest until he died. But again, Galileo was 400 years ago. Hundreds of years before that, Islam was the epicenter of scientific inquiry. It's really important to remember that. And I think, you're talking about the idea of intolerance. There's a book called The Elegant Universe and Fabric of the Cosmos by Brian Greene. He says, exploring the unknown, for an atheist, the unknown might be religion. And for a religious person, the unknown might be scientific, rational, philosophical arguments that do challenge their beliefs, and that's totally fine. he says exploring the unknown requires tolerating uncertainty, requires the humility to know that we don't all know everything, you know? So it is a very important dialogue. And I think I'd just like to quickly say, obviously I know we are running out of time, but I would like to very quickly say that if I believe that a holy book can make me a better person than a person without the holy book, my actions should reflect that. And if my atheist brother or sister in humanity, I know it's very overly simplified. It's a very basic human principle, right? If my atheistic brother or sister in humanity believes that they don't need a holy book to be exceptionally moral, then we need to demonstrate it through our actions. And that's why I think with the GODCAST, we want to have a conversation with the world about religion where we truly respect and love each other as human beings first. Because that's something we all agree on. As human beings first. As humble people, I mean, the last year, 2020, has humbled everyone, without discrimination.
I hope so. Yeah.
I hope so. I would hope so, and we come to realize that we have each other. Every life matters. And whether you believe in God or not, this is an opportunity for us to start a new movement, right? To shape the future in a way where religious people, if they see a non-religious person, they should be extra loving to that person. And if a non-religious person sees a religious person, they should be extra loving to them. Imagine if that was our motivating factor of a general interaction, how that would change the fabric of interaction, social interaction in the world. I think this is the time for those people who don't believe in God to step forward and, out of sympathy, because they believe that they are enlightened, to enlighten religious people out of sympathy, out of love for the truth, out of love for humanity. And those people who are religious, to do the same thing and not condemn anyone to hell when they're not God. Mm-hmm. Instead, if you believe that you have the path, then out of sympathy and love extend the hand. When these two hands meet, although they may diametrically oppose on the concept of God, the idea of humanity will start a new level of dialogue, right? Based in love for one another and trust. And instead of the guttural kind of doggedly negative conversations that we see on social media. And that's, I'm glad you asked our audience. And I would also humbly say, be a part of this conversation. I'm fine with admitting that everything that I said today, perhaps, there may be a million other perspectives, and I would rather be humble and corrected and be willing to be corrected than arrogant and wrong.
Well, Sabahat, thank you very much for being here. The hope is that we walk out of this broadening our understanding of this place we call home. And for far too long, people have used differences as a means of communicating amongst each other in society. Let's find our common denominator. And for the people that have joined us, remember, please leave a comment below. This is just the beginning of the conversation. If you liked our content and are interested in hearing more, please subscribe so you don't miss any of the new episodes. Thank you very much for joining us, and take care.